On y va. I would like to start my presentation looking at this somewhat iconic statue of Jean-François Champollion, situated at the Collège de France in Paris. Champollion's Lettre à Monsieur d'Acier, detailing his decipherment of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, is generally considered to be a foundation document of modern Egyptology, though it should be pointed out that his achievement was seconded by the research of various other European scholars. Before I go a little further into the historical setting of the development of Egyptology, I would like to look at a short YouTube video clip with you. The video is commented in Arabic, but subtitled. Obviously, we are missing the sound, but the subtitles are particularly interesting, of course. So, leaving aside the French subtitles, times a little bit peculiar, the depiction of Champollion putting his boot on the hat of the Egyptian pharaoh obviously offended the feelings of this Egyptian observer. However, the statue representing a strange mélange between Rodin's thinker and a big game hunter was reproduced in bronze in 2014 at the Central Court of the Lycée Champollion in Grenoble to inspire the students. As it seems, the view on scholarly achievements in Egyptology differs between certain groups of people. That, of course, can be attributed to different historic narratives. Egyptology evolved out of a distinct imperialist setting, with Napoleon Bonaparte invading Egypt in 1798, being accompanied by a number of scholars and scientists, or savants, representing the ideals of European Enlightenment. The strategic objective was to threaten British imperial interests, in the long run even rivaling the achievements of Alexander the Great, marching French armies on to India. That eventually came to nothing, and the campaign ended as a military disaster. After the Battle of Aboukir, Napoleon had already fled the scene. The French expeditionary force had to surrender to the British and also had to hand over their spoils, namely various Egyptian antiquities, which, now decorated with numerous derogatory comments by British soldiers, ended up in the British Museum. The Rosetta Stone being the most famous object among those. However, the French insisted on keeping their notes, drawings, and copies of Egyptian texts, and even threatened to burn them rather than to hand them over to the enemy. The Franco-British rivalry lay at the heart of the further development in Egyptology, and with Napoleon's army conquering large parts of Europe, later also inspired the Prussian interest in the lands of the Nile. Having both obtained either the original Rosetta Stone or kept the copies, the British and French entered a competition, spearheaded by Thomas Young and Champollion. Napoleon, for his part, wished to render the outcome of his military failure a little less compromising, and therefore ordered the swift publication of the expedition's both scientific and scholarly results in the volumes of the Description de l'Égypte. When the Prussians considered educational reforms as a countermeasure against French dominance, they already developed the idea to emulate and to surpass the French example, becoming a Kulturmacht, a cultural power. It was for that reason that when Prussia sent its own expedition to Egypt in 1842, the results were published in the folio volumes of the Denkmäler, which simply had to surpass the format and size of the Description. Meanwhile, French and British consuls had begun a fierce competition for gaining further spoils in form of Egyptian antiquities, at times dynamiting monuments into portable size. After the French defeat, also on the European battleground, Egypt had redeveloped into a semi-autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire under the rule of a newly established dynasty founded by Mehmed Ali, who was of Albanian extraction. Under his rule, the first antiquities law was passed, but also numerous ancient Egyptian temples were either turned into fertilizer, using the mud bricks as sebach, or their stones being employed for building factories. What should have become clear so far is that Egyptology developed in an imperial setting against the backdrop of European Enlightenment, national rivalry, but also the process of modernization within the country itself. These structures and processes furthered research and also, to some extent, the preservation of the country's heritage, but were at the same time intertwined with political and economic objectives. The historical chronological definition of modern Egyptology, being initiated during the Napoleonic expedition in 1798, established by the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs in 1822, and institutionalized by professorship at the University of Berlin in 1845, might be scrutinized in various respects. Firstly, both European as well as Egyptian Arabic scholars had dealt with matters Egyptological long before that. German Jesuit Athanasius Kircher achieved the first correct decipherment of, alas, one ancient Egyptian hieroglyph already in the 17th century. He did so by employing the basic methodology which later enabled Champollion to decipher the Egyptian script by using Coptic as a key. The works of Kircher, kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, still show the marginalia of Champollion, thereby even establishing some kind of research tradition. Kircher's achievements were later derided by German Egyptologists, not the least because of their strong anti-Catholic sentiments. Earlier Arab writings on the remains of pharaonic culture for a long time have been completely ignored. Modern Egyptologists did not know of any correct decipherment of hieroglyphs in their writings. However, that brings us to yet another criticism on the definition of Egyptology, being based upon the ability to read hieroglyphs. Nobody will question the usefulness of that achievement, but ancient Egypt, and therefore Egyptology, cannot possibly be reduced to the analysis of textual evidence alone, which in consequence would render the date of decipherment less important for a chronological definition. That leads us to the question, what is Egyptology about? A recent attempt to define Egyptology has been made by John Baines, stating, Egyptology is not a single discipline, but a branch of area studies. Egyptologists study all the aspects of ancient Egypt that they can, across periods from about 7000 BC to the early Middle Ages. No two Egyptologists have the same interests and focuses. Now, this very broad definition actually provides only two parameters, one geographical or regional, the other chronological. The last sentence, however, renders Egyptology a rather individualistic endeavor, which is certainly not entirely unfounded, but would probably raise some objections from Egyptologists around the world and seems also highly impractical if you think of the university setting of a discipline, which clearly needs to be defined beyond the personal foibles of any individual professor. It also does not give any decisive information on whether Egyptology might be primarily defined as a philological, archaeological, orientalist, or cultural anthropological discipline. The latter would, of course, allow a more inclusive concept, as suggested by Professor Baines. But as German Egyptologist Jan Assmann has clearly pointed out, das Projekt einer theoretisch fundierten Kultursoziologie oder Kulturanthropologie hat sich in Deutschland bis heute nicht durchsetzen können und etablieren können. Talking about cultural anthropology in Germany in general, but with particular regard for Egyptology. Given the lack of a clearly defined Egyptological methodology, as described in the writings of John Baines, that also applies to research in that field on an international level. I must admit that I feel unable to solve that dilemma myself. Within the German context, the problem is generally solved, if it is explicitly addressed at all, by defining specific Egyptological competence as the ability to read and translate ancient Egyptian texts, written in hieroglyphs, hieratic, demotic, and Coptic. Other aspects of ancient Egyptian culture, particularly its material culture and art, are to be analyzed by employing, or rather borrowing, methods from neighboring disciplines. Another important aspect in this context is the question of Orientalism. Given the exclusion of Arab and Egyptian writings on ancient Egypt in and the decidedly European Enlightenment background of the intellectual history of the discipline, we must address the question whether Egyptological research constitutes some sort of imperial appropriation of Egyptian cultural heritage and represents a European or Western perspective on ancient Egypt, which might be more properly defined as projection rather than representation. The concept of Orientalism was developed by the American literary scholar Edward W. Said, who, let there be no doubt, initiated an important debate and opened an entirely new perspective on the encounter between Orient and Occident. However, his ideas remained not unchallenged, and the fundamental flaws of his concept have been clearly articulated, particularly regarding Orientalist studies. Put very briefly, I would point out the following. By criticizing the alleged Western concept of, or projection on, the Orient, Said himself reflected a stereotyped, simplistic perspective on the alleged originators of that concept. While there is no Orient, the West is likewise construed. Said focused on Orientalism in Western countries, particularly in France, Britain, and the United States, due to their imperial role in the Middle East. He thereby left out smaller and non-European countries, for example Japan, generally perceived as being part of the West, as well as Germany, claiming that German Orientalism had been, quote, scholarly, but never actual. That is simply wrong and already hints at the next fundamental misconception. Throughout his study, Said never clearly differentiated between Orientalism and Oriental studies, while there is a difference between reception or perception and study, even if the latter is biased. The mentioning of representation, projection, and appropriation of ancient Egypt raises the question, whose cultural heritage are we talking about? The American historian Donald Malcolm Reed has provided us with a groundbreaking study on the interdependency of the development of Egyptian national identity and the attitude towards the pharaonic past. With regard to the role of Egyptology and Western scholars, he formulated a striking assessment, saying, Westerners created Egyptology and eventually taught it to the Egyptians. Egypt owes them a debt for that. But the interest on the debt was exorbitant, and questions of dependency on the West linger in Egyptology as they do in Egyptian national affairs. Both explanations for the tardy emergence of indigenous Egyptology, Egyptian indifference, and Western control of Egyptian archaeology have been overstated by their partisans. One of the most important characteristics of Egyptological research is its clearly defined chronological scope, including, by now, also Egyptian prehistory, but excluding the periods after the Islamic conquest in the 7th century AD. This, however, is not attributable to any form of Egyptological disregard towards Muslims or Arabs, but rather, once again, a result of the philological basis of that discipline, covering ancient Egyptian language up until the Coptic stage, excluding sources written in Arabic. The Christian minority in Egypt, however, endorsed the pharaonic heritage earlier than their Muslim fellow countrymen as a foundation of their identity, which later developed into a distinct concept of Egyptian nationality, sometimes opposed to, sometimes paradoxically aligned with Pan-Arabic or Islamist identity. Egyptology cannot be entirely exculpated in this matter. Due to the close ties of the Coptic with ancient Egyptian language, and maybe also further by Christian solidarity, many, particularly British Egyptologists, developed the idea that the Copts would be the true descendants of the ancient Egyptians. The most prominent proponent of these ideas was British Egyptologist William Matthew Flinders Petrie, who wanted to establish an ethnographic archaeology and therefore wished to study ancient and modern races based on the analysis of monuments as well as the inhabitants of the country. Petrie, being convinced of his exceptional mathematical capabilities, also bequeathed his skull to science, which, due to the turmoil of World War II, can still be admired and, with its fleshy parts preserved, at the Royal College of Surgeons in London. That at least goes to show that some ethnographers do not exclude themselves when it comes to gaining sample material for further study. Petrie believed that the Copts were the true descendants of the pharaohs and also publicized this idea. It must be pointed out that the British imperial administration willingly endorsed that, since it offered a prime opportunity for divide et impera, driving Christian Egyptians and Muslim Egyptians apart. Talking about historic identities and cultural heritage, I would like to discuss things on a broader level, turning attention to the situation in Europe and pose the question, whose cultural heritage is that? Karl der Große, or Charlemagne, has been perceived as the founding figure of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. His burial place was visited by Napoleon Bonaparte, vowing to recreate the empire of the Franks. Nowadays, Charles is frequently referred to as the first European. In a way, he was all of that and nothing. What we are dealing with is historic interpretation or projection, which has nothing too much to do with the real Charles, but more with the self-representation of later generations. Talking about generations and heredity, we might also consider the simple fact that modern-day Germans, British, and French cannot really present themselves as the true heirs and descendants of Vercingetorix, Boudica, or Arminius. These heroes of national resistance against Roman oppression, being successful in the case of the Cherusker and less so in the case of the Gauls, do not represent historic reconstruction, but rather construction of a national or nationalistic past deriving from and serving a distinct socio-political context during the second half of the 19th century. Once you have realized that projecting or constructing historic identity does not require actual proof, or rather any discernible cultural or even genetic ties between the past and the present, people can get extremely inventive. One example would be the British pyramidiad Charles Piazzi Smyth trying to employ, as it turned out, incorrect measurements of the Khufu Cheops pyramid at Giza to prove that the British measurement system was closest to the original God-given sacred cubit. a concept devised by none other than Sir Isaac Newton. Of course, continental measurement systems were deemed inferior by Smythe. Looking at his allegedly scientific chart, one realizes that there is some connection between religious denomination to be detected as well. The most accordance with the pyramid inch is to be found in the British measurement system. Next come the systems in Protestant countries, joined by Orthodox Russia, then the Catholic nations, with the godless French revolutionaries promoting the metric system at last, but still before the colored races of the Muslim world, of course. Smythe's ideas went not unchallenged, and the more criticism he encountered, the more fanciful became his arguments. Why should the sacred cubit of the Bible occur within the measurements of the Giza pyramid? Well, of course, because they were built by the Hebrews during the time of enslavement in the country of the pharaohs. But it gets even better. Since Arabs, rather than Hebrews, were perceived as prime mathematicians in the history of science, Smythe postulated the simultaneous presence of a more knowledgeable and warrior-like Semitic population in Egypt, being some sort of proto-Arabs, and a race of slaves, being Hebrew, or rather Jewish. Since the Hindus, as Smythe referred to the population of the Indian subcontinent, were all too primitive, and, according to him, always had been, Arabs also did not overtake Indian numerals, but the other way round. All this was linked to the idea that the ancient Britons, in a remote past, had migrated as a lost tribe of Israel to the British Isles. Of course, those were the warrior-like super-mathematicians, whereas the Hebrew slave race developed into modern-day Jewry. It is easy to laugh about this British eccentricities as a prime example of crazy chauvinism, but it had, and still has, a very long-lasting effect. When Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin visited Egypt in 1973 and flew over the pyramids, he commented, "To think that the people of Israel were once slaves in Egypt, and then to actually see the places that our forefathers may have built," to the dismay of his Egyptian hosts, of course. But that is not the end of the story. In 2001, the then director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service prevented a DNA analysis of 18th dynasty mummies because the international research team would have been infiltrated by Mossad agents, trying to falsify proof that the pyramids had been built by Hebrews. Zahi Hawass, who openly spreads conspiracy theories about alleged Jewish world dominance, Jews allegedly controlling American media and economy, described himself in an interview he gave to Biblical Archaeology as an anti-Zionist, for he could not be an anti-Semite, being a Semite himself. In 2010, he proudly informed international media that he had, quote, given the Zionist enemy a slap into the face, when he had prevented the reopening of restored Cairo synagogues. Notwithstanding this weird and more than dubitable attitudes, Dr. Hawass is frequently praised for his engagement in returning allegedly stolen objects to Egypt. Among the more prominent ones is the famous bust of Queen Nefertiti. Although the legal questions whether the object rightfully belongs to the Egyptian Museum in Berlin is settled, and Egypt never filed a lawsuit, the claims for its return to Egypt are based on moral arguments. In order to secure the bust for Germany, the archaeologist who found it allegedly employed various tricks, among which my personal favorite is the tale that the Germans used red wine to intoxicate the French official of the Egyptian Antiquities Service before the inspection of the finds. The head of the German excavations at Amana is frequently characterized as cunning, deceitful, devious, shifty, clever, and the like. Interestingly, these characterizations correspond with anti-Jewish stereotypes, which are attributable to medieval Europe and Ottoman Egypt alike. The man who financed the German expedition and subsequently donated the bust of Nefertiti after the division of finds according to the contemporaneous antiquities laws, the German cotton merchant James Simon, was a Jew. The discoverer and archaeologist being in charge of the excavation and also responsible for the organization of the above-mentioned inspection through the Antiquities Service, Ludwig Borchardt, was also a Jew. Now here comes the tricky part. Whereas Egyptian commentators do mention this fact and are stating that it has nothing to do with their moral claim for the bust of Nefertiti, the situation in Germany seems to be quite different. Numerous publications deriving from a post-colonial context also argue for a return of the Queen to her homeland, talking about colonial oppressors or even criminal robbers and rapists, taking away the cultural heritage from their rightful owners. One might discuss all these things, of course, if only in less emotional terms. But to me, it seems rather strange, first to listen to all these all too simple storylines of bad colonial villains motivated by racist attitudes and disdain for the indigenous population, but then hearing nothing about the fact that these supposed bad guys fell victim to racist persecution themselves. That, obviously, would harm the effect. Let there be no doubt that these are complex issues. One should not forget that Borchardt actually was a right-wing German nationalist and a staunch anti-Zionist, which would be a common denominator between him and Dr. Hawass, though. Talking about all these various issues leads us to quite another and definitely more recent phenomenon, which is generally referred to as the woke movement or wokeism, deriving from an expression to describe the awareness of or for inequality caused by racism, chauvinism, or gender discrimination. The mere awareness has become more articulate in recent times and also occasionally more rigorous in its demands for change. I would like to start this section of my presentation with a short clip of a statement by former US President Barack Obama on that topic. And hopefully we have the sound. If not, I will paraphrase.
You know, this idea of purity and you're never compromised and you're always politically woke and all that stuff, you should get over that quickly. The world is messy. There are ambiguities. Yeah. People who do really good stuff have flaws. People who you are fighting may love their kids. And, you know, share certain things with you. And I think that one danger I see among young people, particularly on college campuses, Malia and I talk about this. Yara goes to school with my daughter. But I do get a sense sometimes now among certain young people, and this is accelerated by social media, there is this sense sometimes of the way of me making change is to be as judgmental as possible about other people. And that's enough. Like if I tweet or hashtag about how you didn't do something right or used the wrong verb, or then I can sit back and feel pretty good about myself because, man, you see how woke I was? I called you out. I'm going to get on TV, watch my show, watch Grownish. You know, that's not activism. That's not bringing about change. You know, if all you're doing is casting stones, you know, you're probably not going to get that far. That's easy to do.
The world is messy. Merely being judgmental does not solve any problem. I recently made a personal experience with that phenomenon when joining a group of Egyptologists taking part in the 2020 online conference of the British Society for the History of Science, trying to address various aspects of the history of our discipline, such as the interrelationship of humanities and natural science research, the colonial exploitation of Egypt, racist attitudes, and the impact of politics as well as ideologies on research. We were severely criticized by parts of the audience in the commentary field of the Zoom meeting. Although we discussed some of the more controversial aspects of the history of Egyptological research, we were criticized for focusing our attention on white male scholars for, quote, women were as exploitative and racist as men. Another commentator asked whether this panel was about the decolonization of Egyptology. The moderator directed the commentator's attention to the panel abstract, always a good idea, in which he had clearly stated that what we are going to talk about. Although female racists and decolonizing Egyptology had been intentionally left out by the speakers, we nonetheless tried to address these questions and criticisms in the ensuing discussion, though we clearly did not adopt the emotionalized and undifferentiated tone set by the comments. What enraged our critics even further, who carried this non-discussion to another field and held a Twitter tribunal, without informing any of the speakers or without engaging with them in further discussion. The Twitter trolls, which generally can be and should be ignored, however, comprised tenured professors and scholars sponsored by renowned academic institutions, and expressed themselves in no uncertain terms. At first, they denounced the panelists as being Egyptologists, not historians of science, who would produce histories of Egyptology merely for the purpose of reducing colonial guilt, and would be vastly out of touch. No proof was given in this context, and the few bibliographical references provided to studies into the correct history of Egyptology only showed that the critics had very limited knowledge themselves. Before I go into more detail, I would like to quote from another Twitter debate, stating, "The dirty little secret is that some disciplines don't need to be decolonized, they just need to be shut down entirely." There's no answer to these remarks because there is no common ground for any form of discussion. Turning our attention to the possible foundations for any critical assessment of the history of Egyptology, one has to direct people's attention to the publications and studies on that topic, which in the last 2 decades have become quite numerous. Post-colonial studies, conference volumes on the interdependency of scholarship and politics, individual biographies, institutional histories, archival research, and edition of documents, introductions to the study of disciplinary history, and recently even an international history of world Egyptology, referring only to book publications here, of course. As it seems, the trolls have missed some of these publications shown on the slide. Another impediment for a constructive discussion might be identified in the general tendency to ignore non-English speaking publications, which, by the way, has an extremely detrimental effect for the study of the history of Egyptology. Firstly, because French, Italian, and German publications were and still are of pivotal importance in Egyptological research, but secondly, because the Anglo-Saxon perspective, as a part of a post-colonial narrative, is too narrow and ignores the both national and transnational aspects that need to be considered. So let's talk about these other aspects. In 2017, I co-hosted an international conference on the history of Berlin-based Sudanese archaeology, with a particular focus on the period of the German Democratic Republic in East Berlin. Among various topics, the conference also aimed to appreciate the academic achievements of Ursula Hinze, wife of East Germany's foremost Sudanese archaeologist Fritz Hinze, but also a scholar of African studies in her own right. GDR archaeology in the Sudan operated under the banner of Völkerfreundschaft, or Friendship of People, which was a decidedly anti-imperialist, socialist concept and an integral part of GDR propaganda. During my introductory presentation at the conference, I challenged these ideals by juxtaposing the conference flyer image showing the transport of some column fragment from the Lion Temple of Musawarat es-Sufra in Sudan under the auspices of GDR archaeologists with a drawing from the 1840s Lepsius expedition depicting the transport of a ram-headed sphinx at Jebel Barkal. That, of course, was not meant to prove that nothing would have changed and that the attitudes and ethics of German Egyptologists, whether from the Kingdom of Prussia or under real existing socialism, hadn't changed. But it certainly called out the all too simple interpretations of allegedly colonial imagery. Another interesting example for the dangers of visual representation and misinterpretation was discussed in a poster exhibition during the conference, organized with some students of the Humboldt University Department for Archaeology and Cultural History in Northeast Africa. One poster discussed a photograph showing one of the Sudanese assistants of the expedition photographer during an epigraphic survey taking a paper squeeze from an inscription. As it turned out, the records of the expedition diary clearly stated that this picture had been arranged for a press photo and that the inscription had been already copied by a German scholar. This alleged delusion in the name of Völkerfreundschaft is a little more complex, for the Sudanese assistant in question actually was fulfilling more qualified tasks, if not in this particular situation. Another problem arose from the recordings of events in the expedition diaries written by Ursula Hintze, complaining about the filthy conditions in Upper Egypt and the more progressive situation in northern Sudan, where a lower number of women and girls wearing headscarves would indicate a higher level of civilization. Of course, Egypt was the turf of Federal Republic of Western German Egyptologists, whereas the GDR concentrated its efforts in the Sudan. Leading representatives of both German nations had actually agreed on an informal partition of these spheres of interest. The expedition diaries therefore also reflected the inner German tensions and should not be taken too easily as proof for a colonial mindset of Ursula Hintze. However, the question somewhat incommoded the general narrative of a female heroine in the history of archaeology, and was therefore removed from the poster drafts. That, of course, was a mistake, and I now regret that I, as a co-organizer, consented to this. Even more so, because I recently had to realize that my former co-host, meanwhile, promotes the idea that GDR Sudanese archaeology had been a forerunner of the post-colonial movement. I would be very open to explore that possibility or that line of interpretation. However, I must clearly point out the various complications in that rather simplistic representation of the past. Or, in other words, the world is a little bit too messy for that. Certainly too messy for simply adopting a Cold War propaganda concept without any scrutiny regarding the actual evidence, and hushing up anything that could question the new hagiographic representation, particularly of the contribution of women archaeologists. There's another personal observation I would like to share, which I made during the annual meeting of German-speaking Egyptologists, the Ständige Ägyptologenkonferenz in 2018. One of the speakers gave a lecture on the racist bias of Egyptological research in Nubia and the historic interrelationship of ancient Egyptians and Nubians. The question whether the ancient Egyptians had been a colored race first became an obsession of North American scholars and scientists who, already during the midst of the 19th century, had begun to collect mummy skulls and alleged ancient Egyptian depictions of various races in order to find out, or rather to disprove, the notion that the founders of that great civilization might have been Negroes. If that had been the case, monogenist versus polygynist religious debates would have been turned upside down, and the evolutionist movement might have gained the upper hand. This questionable research tradition continued to impact and impair American research into ancient Egyptian history, for even leading specialists of the 20th century, like George Andrew Reisner, could not bring themselves to accept evidence of a black civilization and mutual influence of Egyptians and Nubians to one another. Later, German Egyptologists, no longer content with the alternative concept of an Asian invasion of Northeast Africa, bringing about civilization development there, refuted that Semitic migration theory and proposed a northern invasion of fair-skinned, blonde northerners, bringing civilization to the lands of the Nile instead. After the presentation and historic evaluation of these Egyptological debates on racial history, the organizer of the conference in Münster urged the speaker to engage with parts of the audience, namely peoples of color, in order to avoid any misunderstanding that the presentation, given in German, would have endorsed or argued for a continuation of that racial or racist discourse in the study of Egyptology. At the time, I mistakenly identified the addressees of that clarification as representatives of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, attending the proceedings as honorary guests. I was later informed by my colleague, who had given the presentation, however, that that was not the case. They had been Sudanese students requiring a very different form of reassurance. Yes, the talk should not be mistaken for an endorsement of racist concepts within Egyptological research, but there is another sensitive issue to be considered, namely that Upper Egyptians, and even more so Nubians, suffer from racist discrimination by Lower Egyptians, considering themselves to be white and Arab, as opposed to the black and African Southerners. This attitude is also expressed in the derogatory terms Abid and Fadija, clearly showing that even amongst people of color, racial discrimination occurs, and also that some Egyptian scholars willingly endorse the idea that pharaohs were white or Semite instead of dark-skinned and African. As we can see, there are various issues and problems to be considered in the history of Egyptology. Looking forward to the centenary of the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun by Howard Carter, I would like to point out that the probably most famous, if not most popular, Egyptologist actually was no Egyptologist at all. Carter had never studied Egyptology, was unable to read longer hieroglyphic inscriptions, and rather represented some sort of a self-made man, for which he is, until today, both admired and despised. Reflecting conflicts arising from a continuous process of professionalization of the discipline on the one hand, and the lack of a clear definition of what actually constitutes Egyptology and an Egyptologist on the other. Another candidate for discussing certain issues may even still be remembered amongst a Belgian audience. Friedrich Wilhelm von Bissing, son of German Governor-General Moritz von Bissing during the time of the illegal German occupation of Belgium in World War I, and actively engaged in the Flamization campaign of the occupation forces, but also a victim of discrimination due to his sexual orientation, which was the reason why he lost his professorship at Utrecht University in later life. Then there is Amelia Blandford Edwards, co-founder of the Egypt Exploration Fund and sponsor of the first British University chair in Egyptology. Amelia Edwards had originally intended to give that professorship either to Oxford or Cambridge, granted that they would allow women to study and graduate and finally obtain a PhD in Egyptology. That was not to be, and so the chair went to the University College London. Then there are Egyptian Egyptologists to be considered, like Selim Hassan, who was recently commemorated as Legend of Egyptology in an exhibition in Alexandria. Accompanying this event, a short biopic was launched, which I would like to show you. I think we have to turn off the microphone again. Subtitled again, but it's not shown on the screen, unfortunately.
It's not.
Okay, we leave it out.
Sorry.
No problem. I'll just sum it up. The protagonist of that film is presented as a national hero of Egyptology, paving the way for Egyptian engagement in archaeological excavations, demanding the return of stolen antiquities, defying the whims of former King Farouk. And why should Egyptians not be entitled to their fair share in self-aggrandizing, hagiographic, and uncritical disciplinary history writing? It has taken Western Egyptologists quite some time to overcome reluctance to assess critically the works of their predecessors, which might still be stronger amongst Egyptian colleagues, who yet face, at times, very uncritical devaluation of their achievements. It would be unjust and counterproductive to ignore these sensitivities. However, in the end, there can and there should be no alternative paradigm for the disciplinary history of Egyptian Egyptology. That brings me to my concluding remarks concerning a possible way out of all these dilemmas. In the context of Orientalism as inaugurated by Edward W. Said, but also the wider post-colonial discourse, Eurocentrism has been identified as the central problem. After having invested so much time and effort in showing that the world is messy and things get easily complicated, you will not be surprised that I am quite skeptical concerning this seemingly simple answer. However, before going into detail, I wish to point out a central dilemma regarding this idea. While in past, white people, more often men than women, were telling the allegedly uncivilized nations of the world what to do, even enforcing progress and advancement by violent means, nowadays, white academics are telling people of color that their predecessors might have erred, but that now the post-colonialists would make amends and tell them what to do in order to overcome the limitations imposed on them by previous generations of self-proclaimed white do-gooders. Of course, this seems somewhat polemic, but let's concentrate on the very practical problem of having to replace the Eurocentric perspective in a decidedly Eurocentric academic setting. What would be the solution to that? Dismantling European academia altogether? Firing all European scholars, replacing them by people of color? Even if you could do that, what would be the outcome? What would be the alternative paradigm? Let me provide just one last example of things getting messy, this time concerning ancient Egyptian art. Reading the quotation stating that ancient Egypt, despite its remarkable achievements, was fatally doomed to fall short of producing great art, you would probably assume that it derived from a 19th century publication convinced of the superiority of the classical Greek and Renaissance tradition of European art, with which the ancient Egyptians could never compete. Well, you would be wrong. Further completing the quotation, the term collectivism and its alleged impact on ancient Egyptian art production, or rather its absence, seems to echo new archaeology or processual archaeology. But this quotation actually stems from a rather recent publication, which in essence denies the existence of ancient Egyptian art, because the very concept of art would have been superimposed by Eurocentric scholarship. This is grotesque, and I wonder whether non-Europeans would really be so happy about this assessment. But of course it reveals what might be termed the post-colonial dilemma. To summarize its main components, I would name the following aspects. Shifting the Eurocentric perspective not only raises the question of how to replace it, but also, as a process, is actually taking place in an intellectual, conceptual, academic frame determined by European intellectual history. Wokeists telling people that their academic cultural practices have been morally wrong, and that they themselves are incapable of necessary change. Others must take care of that. And fundamentally transforming procedures in the name of an alleged moral superiority comes very close to define some misguided efforts in post-colonialism, and, what almost enrages these people most, shows a striking similarity to a truly colonial attitude. I do not wish to end my presentation by simply pointing out fundamental difficulties, but would like to offer some suggestions to resolve at least some of the problems, concentrating on the case of Egyptology. Let me first propose a working definition of what constitutes Egyptology and what defines an Egyptologist. Egyptology might be defined as a multidisciplinary area or regional study actually predating the Napoleonic expeditions, including both natural science and the humanities, as well as European and non-European practitioners. The term Egyptologist, male or female, Western or non-Western, might be more narrowly defined, if keeping in mind that in some cases, and particularly at certain points in the history of the discipline, such a narrow definition might not apply and would therefore be rendered useless. As to this narrow definition of an Egyptologist, I would cite the German sociologist of science, Hans-Josef Trümpner, who, at the beginning of the 1980s, suggested that in the case of Egyptology, Grammatik und Sprachbeherrschung erfüllen stellvertretend die Funktion von Wissenschaftstheorie. Indeed, it is the decipherment of hieroglyphs which in most histories of Egyptology is presented as the point of departure for the development of the discipline. That also explains why earlier failed attempts at decipherment, as well as non-linguistic studies, are commonly relegated to the discipline's prehistory. Furthermore, it provides an alternative explanation for the chronological limitation of Egyptology. Coptic studies open the way to the decipherment of the hieroglyphic script, and so the concentration on the pre-Islamic, non-Arabic speaking period is justified by the core competence of Egyptologists being able to read and translate Egyptian texts written in hieroglyphic, hieratic, demotic, and Coptic script. Then there is the fundamental question of my talk, whether Egyptology needs to be decolonized. A practical solution would lie in the empowerment of Egyptian Egyptologists through training, university teaching, internship, and foreign exchange programs, as well as international cooperation, which can be wholeheartedly embraced. Being the disciplinary historian that I am, however, I must inform you that these measures date back almost to the colonial beginnings of Egyptology. The first Egyptian antiquities law being inspired by European scholars, a first school for Egyptian Egyptologists being installed and run by Europeans already during the 1880s. Furthermore, there is the observation by some historians that by adopting the colonial Egyptological administrative structures for their own purposes, the Egyptian elites around the midst of the 20th century were not exactly empowering the Egyptian people. Once again, highlighting the complexity of the various issues involved, I would clearly state that Egyptology does not need any kind of Wokeism, since it is often ill-informed, judgmental, impractical, and does not bring about positive change. Always keep in mind the post-colonial dilemma, warning us that things are more easily destroyed than built, and that anybody who wishes to dismantle Egyptology should think about the consequences and provide some alternative. The only constructive solution to these challenges is to raise awareness of the various subjective factors coming into play when analyzing the history of any given academic discipline. First and foremost, the bias of the disciplinary historian himself. Zeitgeist should not be employed as an excuse. On the contrary, individual responsibilities, decisions, and personal choices must be highlighted. Their defects and negative consequences